By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had reached its cruel crescendo. The Allied invasion of Normandy had broken the German Western Wall, but the cost was staggering. From the hedgerows of France to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the ground was soaked with the blood of two armies locked in exhaustion. When Hitler launched his final gamble, the Ardennes offensive, tens of thousands of young German soldiers were thrown into the chaos once more. Many would never return home. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, as American armor pushed east toward the Rhine, the scale of German surrender shocked even Eisenhower's planners. Nearly 350,000 German troops were captured between December 1944 and May 1945. What followed was one of the largest humanitarian and logistical operations in modern military history. The processing, transport, and medical care of an enemy army suddenly without a nation. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, signatory nations were obligated to treat prisoners of war humanely, to provide shelter, food, and medical attention equal to that of their own soldiers. The United States had ratified that agreement and, for the most part, lived by its letter. Every captured German, whether a foot soldier or a Luftwaffe pilot, became a patient if he was wounded. And in a theatre already strained by casualties, that decision carried moral weight as well as operational consequence. American field hospitals in northern France and Belgium had been designed to treat Allied wounded. By late 1944, they were filled with men from both sides. Medical triage no longer asked who a man fought for, only how long he could survive without help. Surgeons recorded cases by numbers, not flags. A bullet wound in a shoulder was a wound in a shoulder, whether the arm had fired a Garand or a Mauser. Many of the Germans arriving at these hospitals came straight from snow-choked roads, frostbitten and half-starved. Their expectations were shaped by years of propaganda. Nazi briefings had warned that capture by the Allies meant mutilation or slow death. Posters showed Americans as butchers, Jews, and monsters in uniform. Yet, when they were carried into the medical tents, the scene was something else entirely. Antiseptic light, white sheets, measured voices, order. The United States Army Medical Department, under Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk, had by 1945 built a vast and disciplined medical machine. From the front line to the continental United States, wounded soldiers were moved through a chain of care unprecedented in its scale. Each step was designed to preserve life, a principle that did not change with the color of the uniform. Field medics, often teenagers themselves, were among the first to test that principle. Reports describe American corpsmen kneeling in shell holes, bandaging German soldiers before their own evacuation. The famous Red Cross on the medic's helmet, sometimes the only symbol that could survive the battlefield's chaos, became both a shield and a promise. Behind the lines, evacuation hospitals and general hospitals took on a new rhythm. After the Bulge, entire wards were quietly reserved for German prisoners. They were guarded, yes, but they were also treated with penicillin, morphine, and plasma, the same life-saving tools used on GIs. American nurses cleaned their wounds, surgeons repaired shattered limbs, and chaplains sometimes offered prayer even when the patient could not understand the words. This was not universal compassion. There were moments of resentment, especially among medics who had lost friends to the very men they were saving. But orders were clear. The Geneva Convention must be upheld, not for the enemy's sake, but for America's moral integrity and its own soldiers' protection if captured. As one medical officer later wrote, "Every German treated fairly was an insurance policy for our boys behind their lines." And so, as the Reich began to crumble, the strange coexistence of enemies under one roof became a quiet symbol of what remained human in war. The machinery of mercy that emerged in 1944-45 was as vast as any weapon system the United States had built. It stretched from field tents in Belgium to brick hospital wards in Texas, linked by trains, ships, and a bureaucracy that recorded every pulse and bandage. When a wounded soldier, American or German, was pulled from the front, he entered what was known as the evacuation chain. The first stop was the battalion aid station, a canvas shelter close to the line where medics stopped bleeding, stabilized shock, and tagged the patient. Next came the collecting station, then the clearing station, where doctors decided who could move and who could not. The most critical were rushed by ambulance convoys to evacuation hospitals, mobile, semi-permanent units capable of surgery. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended, Dozens of these hospitals dotted northern France, Luxembourg, and Belgium, treating up to 1,000 men at once. Inside those wards, the rhythm was relentless. Operations began before dawn and ended long after dark. Surgeons worked in teams of 3, rotating every 12 hours. Nurses administered plasma and antibiotics, their faces hidden behind masks darkened by lamp smoke. There was no time for politics. A heartbeat was reason enough. Among the staff were Army Nurse Corps veterans hardened by North Africa and Sicily, and younger women newly arrived from the United States, many barely in their 20s. Some were shocked to find themselves treating the enemy. Others saw it as a test of their oath. One nurse wrote in her diary, "They come in grey, terrified, waiting for punishment. When we touch them gently, some start to cry." Behind the front, the logistical web expanded. Hospital trains, long chains of olive drab cars marked with red crosses, carried wounded men westward. Those stable enough for sea travel boarded Liberty ships refitted as hospital vessels, bound for ports in Britain or directly across the Atlantic. By early 1945, hundreds of German prisoners were among them, shipped to permanent facilities across the United States. At home, America had quietly prepared for this flood. Over 400 POW camps were established nationwide, and several were linked directly to general hospitals under the Army Service Forces. In places like Camp Bowie, Texas, Fort Knox, Kentucky, and Camp Grant, Illinois, German soldiers found themselves in wards that looked almost civilian: tiled floors, clean sheets, even radios. They were treated by teams that included US doctors, Red Cross representatives, and in some cases, German medical orderlies drawn from the prisoner ranks. This system functioned not just out of humanitarian impulse, but strategic calculation. Healthy prisoners required fewer guards, could perform labor, and, most importantly, demonstrated America's adherence to international law. Each well-run hospital became a statement of contrast to the atrocities emerging from the East. Where Nazi camps had turned medicine into murder, the Allies sought to turn war's detritus back into life. Yet, within the wards, tension still lingered. American staff were instructed never to fraternize, though compassion often blurred the line. Letters and Red Cross parcels passed between beds. Some POWs volunteered to donate blood for wounded Americans. Others painted murals or played instruments to ease the silence. A few even wrote home describing their disbelief. "The Americans treat us as if we were their own wounded," one wrote from a hospital in Oklahoma. The war's bureaucrats documented everything: temperature charts, surgical notes, discharge papers stamped "enemy alien," but beneath the paperwork was a quiet transformation. The same system that had once been built to heal American soldiers now became a bridge between enemies, an unlikely mirror showing that moral strength could exist alongside military power. By the time the snow melted across Europe, tens of thousands of Germans had survived because of this machinery of compassion, and among them were men who would carry a new kind of memory home, one that questioned everything they had been told about mercy and the enemy. From here, the story narrows again, from the machinery to the human faces within it, from the system to the souls who lived it. The story of mercy in war is not written in policy, but in faces, those moments when conviction meets compassion, and both tremble. Among the Germans treated in American hospitals, the first reaction was almost always disbelief. Many arrived expecting interrogation or execution. Instead, they found white sheets and steady hands. In testimonies collected after the war, former POWs spoke of the quiet, of how strange it felt to be spoken to in calm English, not shouted at. One recalled lying on an operating table in France, the surgeon above him wearing a mask and humming softly. Only later did he realize the man saving his leg had lost his own brother in Normandy. This paradox, to help the man who may have killed your friend, defined the moral temperature of those wards. For American medics, the Geneva Convention was not just a legal shield, it was a compass. Many had seen villages burned and comrades mutilated. They carried the rage of war like an extra limb, yet the act of treating the enemy demanded they set it down, if only for a moment. A medic named Robert Daniels, who served with the 45th Infantry Division, later wrote, "It wasn't forgiveness, it was habit. You see a wound, you fix it. You stop thinking about who it belongs to." Some nurses, though, found that impossible. Many had cared for Allied soldiers whose bodies bore the marks of German cruelty. Bayonet wounds, frostbite from forced marches, cigarette burns, Treating Germans immediately afterward could feel unbearable. One nurse from the 12th Evacuation Hospital recorded in her journal, "A boy came in with a swastika ring on his finger. I almost left him, then he moaned like any other boy. So I stayed." The Germans too underwent their own reckoning. Their propaganda had taught them that capture meant degradation. But in the wards of the US Army, that myth collapsed. A corporal from the Volksgrenadier divisions, shot through the chest at Bastogne, later wrote, "I thought they would let me die. Instead, they gave me soup." Such gestures, small and practical, carried moral shockwaves. The Americans' adherence to procedure, their insistence on fairness even toward the defeated, struck many POWs as incomprehensible. Some believed it was a trick, a preparation for interrogation. Others wept openly, unable to reconcile kindness with captivity. Yet, for the Americans, compassion was not always gentle. It was disciplined. Every bandage tied around a German limb was also a statement of control. Control over hatred, over vengeance, over the chaos of a world that had lost its shape. By treating the enemy, they affirmed the difference between what they fought for and what they fought against. In the quiet hours between operations, human glimpses surfaced. A wounded German asked to see the nurse who had stitched his arm. She hesitated, unsure what he wanted. When she approached, he simply said, "Danke." Another, upon learning that his surgeon was Jewish, broke down in silence. The moral dimension ran both ways. For many Germans, this unexpected decency became their first encounter with a society that valued rules over race. Years later, sociologists studying post-war reconciliation noted how many former POWs in America returned home, transformed, some even choosing to emigrate back to the United States after 1948 behind. Every antiseptic corridor lay a human, battlefield where conscience fought ideology. The instruments of healing, scalpels, clamps, syringes, became tools of quiet defiance against the brutality that had defined the 20th century's darkest years. The same surgeons who repaired torn flesh were, in a sense, repairing the moral order itself. They were proving that mercy could be an act of discipline, not weakness. And in those dimly lit tents, amid the hiss of oxygen and the smell of iodine, a fragile truth began to take root. That war reveals what nations destroy, but medicine reveals what they still refuse to let die. Yet compassion was not only a matter of conscience, it was also a function of law, command, and calculation, the practical face of morality in an industrial war. Beneath the human drama of those wards lay a vast network of planning and technology, a system that allowed compassion to function with military precision. War, after all, is logistics, and mercy, in 1945, was run on a schedule. The US Army Medical Department operated with the efficiency of a factory, yet its product was survival. From Normandy to the Rhine, it moved tens of thousands of wounded through a conveyor of treatment that relied on innovation as much as empathy. The same principles that had guided production of tanks and aircraft were applied to plasma, morphine, and penicillin. By late 1944, every evacuation hospital carried refrigeration units for blood storage, sterilization chambers, and portable X-ray machines, technologies that revolutionized battlefield medicine. When German POWs entered this system, they entered modernity itself. Many had come from an army now running on fumes, where medical supply lines had collapsed under Allied bombing. German field medics often reused bandages, and penicillin, still scarce in Europe, was virtually unknown among Wehrmacht ranks. To be treated by Americans was to step into a world of precision instruments, clean gauze, and drugs whose names most had never heard. This technological contrast became a moral one. Where the Nazi regime had corrupted medicine into ideology, doctors serving the state rather than the patient, the American model insisted on neutrality. A wound was chemistry, not politics. A heartbeat was worth time and plasma regardless of uniform. It wasn't only doctors who carried this creed. Leadership at the highest levels reinforced it. General Norman T. Kirk, the Surgeon General of the US Army, emphasized that adherence to the Geneva Convention was a strategic necessity as much as a moral one. In an internal circular, he wrote, "The care of the enemy sick and wounded is a test not of their civilization, but of ours." Commanders understood that word of fair treatment spread quickly through the German ranks. Interrogation reports confirmed it. Prisoners captured later in the war often surrendered more readily, convinced they would be treated humanely. In this way, Hospital compassion became a weapon of morale, disarming the enemy without a shot. But not all leadership decisions were clean. Treating the enemy drained resources from American wounded. Plasma shipments were finite, nurses exhausted. Commanders occasionally questioned priorities, especially during the winter crises, when frostbite, trench foot, and shrapnel overwhelmed the wards. Yet the orders held firm. Triage by need, not nationality. The moral line could not bend, even under strain. Beyond the front, American hospitals on home soil reflected a quieter version of the same discipline. At Camp Carson General Hospital in Colorado, for instance, separate POW wards were run under strict but humane conditions. German doctors among the prisoners were allowed to assist under American supervision, turning former soldiers into aides. It was an early form of reconciliation. Enemy expertise folded into Allied healing. The American Red Cross played its part too, acting as liaison between the Army and international inspectors. They distributed cigarettes, books, and letters, ensuring that even within captivity, a trace of dignity survived. German patients, accustomed to a system that glorified hierarchy, were startled to see black nurses and orderlies working alongside white doctors, a quiet symbol of an imperfect but visible equality. Technology gave structure to this moral code. Penicillin, first mass-produced by the Allies, saved thousands of lives, both American and German. Blood plasma, standardized and shipped in tin boxes across the Atlantic, blurred the boundary between enemy and friend. In one recorded case, a German prisoner in Belgium received a transfusion from an American donor whose name he never knew. The irony was not lost on the surgeons, yet even science could not erase hatred entirely. Propaganda still lingered in the minds of the captured. Some German officers refused treatment, convinced it was a trick. One spat at an American nurse, screaming that he would rather die. The nurse continued to clean his wound until he passed out. Later, when he woke and found himself alive, he reportedly wept. By spring 1945, these contradictions, technological mastery, bureaucratic efficiency, and moral restraint, defined the Allied identity as much as their tanks or bombers. The hospital became a quiet battlefield of its own, where America fought not for territory, but for principle. For the Germans lying under American care, this efficiency was as terrifying as it was merciful. They had been told that the West was decadent, that democracy meant decay. Instead, they witnessed a system that functioned not through fear, but through order and ethics. And in that realization, some of the war's most unrecorded victories occurred, victories of conscience, of civilization asserting itself over chaos. But the truest test of that conscience was yet to come, when the lines of mercy and hatred met at their breaking point in the heat of battle and the cold of triage. It was January 6, 1945, the dying frost of the Ardennes offensive. Outside the Belgian village of Malmedy, an American evacuation hospital, the 67th Evac Hospital, 9th Army, struggled beneath the weight of two wars, one of bullets and one of conscience. Snow had turned to slush, the tents sagging under their own damp weight. Inside, kerosene lamps flickered like breath on glass, the smell of iodine thick as smoke. The convoy that arrived before dawn carried both kinds of wounded. The first stretchers bore Americans, infantrymen from the 30th Division, pale and trembling, their boots frozen to their feet. But behind them came the unexpected cargo, captured Germans, some still in field grey, others half wrapped in US blankets. They had been dug out of a half-collapsed farmhouse 2 miles north, hit by American artillery the night before. Among them was Obergefreiter Karl Voss, 22, shot through the abdomen. His unit, remnants of the 12th SS Panzer, had been caught in retreat. The American medics who found him hesitated. His uniform bore the insignia of a division infamous for the Malmedy massacre, where over 80 US prisoners were executed only weeks earlier. Some of the orderlies had known men who died there. When they carried Voss into the triage tent, the temperature in the room dropped further. Captain James Halperin, the chief surgeon, stared at the young man's dog tags. His hands shook once, then steadied. He turned to his nurse. "Prep him for surgery," the nurse hesitated. "Sir, we've got 4 of ours waiting. I know what he is," Halperin cut in, voice flat. "But he'll die before them if we wait." It wasn't compassion that guided him. It was order, a medical law as absolute as gravity. The wounded were treated by urgency, not allegiance. Outside, the rumble of distant guns echoed through the hills. Inside, scalpels gleamed under lamplight. For 2 hours, the team worked in silence. The wound was deep, the intestines ruptured. A nurse kept the ether steady, watching the boy's pulse dance at the edge of nothing. When it was done, Halperin stepped back, exhausted, blood soaking the front of his apron. He looked at the face on the table, young, almost angelic beneath the pallor. "You're not going to die today," he murmured, too quietly for anyone else to hear. When the operation ended, one of the orderlies, Private Frank Dill, muttered, "He's SS, sir." "Why save him?" Halperin didn't answer. He simply removed his gloves, tossed them into the bucket and said, "Because we're not." Outside the tent, a jeep arrived with another load of wounded, this time American. The triage board filled with new names, all marked critical. The team turned back to work without pause. Hours later, Voss regained consciousness. He opened his eyes to the sound of English voices, then to the sight of a nurse checking his pulse. Her badge read, Liltine H. Carter. She noticed his confusion, then his fear. He whispered in broken English, You will not shoot?" She shook her head. "No, just breathe." Voss tried to thank her, but the words stuck in his throat. The last thing he remembered before blacking out again was her adjusting his blanket, a small, unthinking kindness that unsettled him more than the wound itself. For the Americans, the day blurred into night. There were no speeches, no moral revelations, just the rhythm of triage. One body to the next, life to death to life again. Yet something lingered in that tent, something heavier than the smell of disinfectant. The medics could not know that the story of that day would ripple beyond the war, that years later, German veterans would recall American hospitals not as prisons but as sanctuaries, places where the enemy had been treated as a man, not a monster. But that understanding began in moments like this, a single decision, made without glory, under flickering light, in the cold heart of a collapsing front. The moral axis of the war, in that instant, tilted slightly toward the light, and yet, as the Allied advance surged east, new dilemmas arose, choices even harder than mercy in a tent, whether the same compassion could hold when vengeance, exhaustion, and the weight of the dead pressed on every soul. By February 1945, the snow had begun to retreat from the Ardennes, leaving behind a battlefield soaked with thaw and memory. The 67th Evacuation Hospital near Malmedy was quieter now, though the scent of carbolic still clung to the canvas walls like penance. The wounded were fewer, but the moral fatigue was heavier than ever. Captain James Halperin, the surgeon who had operated on the SS soldier, hadn't spoken of that night. There was no report, no commendation. He simply moved to the next patient, the next convoy, the next hour of exhaustion. Yet the story of that operation spread quietly among the staff. It wasn't retold as an act of heroism, only as a measure of what the war was costing them inside. Nurse Helen Carter, the one who had whispered, "Just breathe," found herself thinking of the German often. His cot was near the back, separated by a curtain from American patients. He never spoke much, but when he did, it was polite, almost formal. One morning he asked if she had lost anyone in the war. She froze, unsure how to answer. "My brother," she said finally. "North Africa." The boy nodded, eyes lowered. "I am sorry." It was not forgiveness, just the human instinct to acknowledge loss. But for Carter, it felt like something close to surrender, not of principle, but of hatred. Elsewhere in the ward, not everyone felt the same. Private Frank Dill, who had questioned Halperin's decision to operate, still seethed quietly. He wrote in his letter home, "We save them, feed them, patch them up. But Joe from my platoon died in the snow with no morphine." It doesn't sit right. That conflict between duty and rage haunted every medic in Europe. The Geneva Convention was not a shield against emotion. It demanded obedience to something higher than feeling, and in the final months of the war, that obedience was tested more than ever. As Allied units pushed into Germany, the tide of prisoners became a flood. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with frostbite, burns, and gunshot wounds, many of them German. The medics did what they were trained to do, treat the most urgent first. Some of those they saved would later walk into captivity and see the ruins of their homeland. Others would die beneath the same hands that had once held scalpels, now folded in prayer. For the Germans, this mercy was shattering. Captured diaries and post-war interviews reveal a shared astonishment. The enemy they had been taught to fear showed restraint their own regime had long abandoned. "We were told Americans would torture us," wrote one captured officer in April 1945. "Instead, a nurse gave me chocolate while changing my bandage. That small kindness travelled far beyond that hospital tent." POW rumours spread fast, faster than military communiques. Word of fair treatment reached frontline units, sometimes softening resistance. In certain sectors, surrender rates increased notably once troops realised capture no longer meant cruelty. Humanitarian conduct had become indirectly a weapon of efficiency. But it also carried a hidden cost. Compassion drained men who had already given everything. Medics suffered some of the highest burnout rates in the European theatre, sleep-deprived, half-starved, and surrounded by death. They learned that saving lives could erode the soul as surely as taking them. A chaplain attached to the 45th Division recorded, "We asked them to be angels in hell. Even the German patients sensed the strain. Some offered to help, changing dressings, carrying supplies, even volunteering to translate for new arrivals. A few drew portraits of their American doctors. Small pencil sketches traded for cigarettes or bread. These quiet exchanges formed a strange truce, not between nations, but between human beings trapped inside the machinery of empire." As the Reich collapsed, the American hospitals became waypoints between two worlds. Trucks rolled east with medicine and west with prisoners. German soldiers treated one week were loading stretchers the next, now working under guard to save others. The act of healing had transcended allegiance. It had become survival's final language. Captain Halperin never forgot the SS boy. When the war ended in May, he received a brief note through Red Cross channels, written in hesitant English, signed Karl Voss. It read, "You gave me life. I will not waste it. Thank you." Halperin kept that note folded in his journal for the rest of his life. He never answered it, perhaps because the letter was enough. Proof that somewhere amid the ruin, one act of principle had pierced the fog. And so, by war's end, American hospitals had done more than mend flesh. They had quietly dismantled an enemy myth, that compassion was weakness, that democracy meant decay. Each successful surgery, each shared cigarette, each unspoken forgiveness, chipped away at the walls propaganda had built. In the ruins of Europe, vengeance had been easy to find. Mercy required strength. And when the shooting finally stopped, the true reckoning began. The aftermath of conscience, policy, and memory that would shape both nations long after the wounds had closed. May 1945. The guns finally fell silent. The Reich was in ruins, and the tide of prisoners reached into the millions. Across Western Europe, makeshift barbed wire enclosures spread like scars across the landscape. But amid the chaos, one network continued its quiet, disciplined work. The American Medical Corps. At its height, the US Army Medical Department was caring for nearly 900,000 German POWs across Europe and the United States. The same medics who had endured the Ardennes, Anzio, and Normandy now faced a different battle against disease, hunger, and despair. Typhus outbreaks in prison camps threatened to undo what the Geneva Convention had promised. So American doctors deployed inoculation drives, rehydration stations, and mass hygiene programs. These efforts saved tens of thousands of lives, most of them enemy soldiers. Reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross confirmed what few believed possible. German prisoners under US control received adequate rations, medical attention, and humane treatment, often surpassing conditions civilians faced in post-war Germany. One 1946 ICRC report noted, "The conduct of American medical personnel has demonstrated a profound adherence to the principles of the Convention. Treatment has been impartial and, in many cases, exceptionally compassionate." For many American doctors, this recognition carried a strange ambivalence. They had fulfilled their oath, yes, but they also carried the faces of friends lost, villages destroyed, families shattered. Healing the enemy did not erase the past. It simply forced them to confront it differently. Meanwhile, the German prisoners themselves began writing letters, memoirs, and post-war testimonies that filtered through to Allied authorities. Over and over, one phrase appeared: "We could not understand their mercy." Some POWs described disbelief when US nurses treated them before American soldiers, purely on the basis of injury severity. Others wrote of shared meals, impromptu Christmas services, and medical staff who refused bribes or gifts. In time, this consistent experience began to reshape the defeated soldiers' view of their captors. A few later became doctors themselves, inspired by the example they had witnessed in captivity. Historian Arnold Kramer, who studied German POWs in America, wrote, "The treatment they received did more to denazify them than any re-education pamphlet ever could." That transformation wasn't deliberate policy at first. It was moral inertia, carried forward by men and women too disciplined to abandon their principles, even when it made no practical sense. But the ripple effects were undeniable. By 1946, US POW hospitals were being used as training centers for German medical students. Captured physicians worked alongside their former enemies under American supervision, helping to rebuild a shattered health infrastructure. Back home, however, the story was less tidy. Many veterans returning from Europe found it hard to accept that the same enemy who had bombed London or shelled Bastogne was being cared for at American expense. Letters to newspapers questioned the morality of coddling killers. The War Department defended its stance simply: a soldier's duty is not vengeance, but victory, and humanity strengthens both. Still, the unease lingered. The wounds of the war were too fresh. Some nurses burned the sketches given to them by German patients, unable to explain to family members why they had kept them. Others, like Captain Halperin and Nurse Carter, carried silent pride, not in who they had saved, but in what they had refused to become. The true magnitude of this moral front line only emerged years later. Medical ethics scholars, studying field records from 1944-1946, found thousands of operations performed on enemy prisoners, amputations, transfusions, reconstructive surgeries, all meticulously logged and cross-checked. Each entry was a quiet declaration that civilization had survived the fire. But history rarely rewards mercy with recognition. The names of those medics seldom appeared in victory parades. Their work existed in the margins, where humanity met exhaustion and still refused to break. Yet their example, unheralded and unromantic, would become one of the most enduring legacies of the war. The proof that even in history's darkest chapters, compassion was not extinguished, only tested. By 1947, the world had begun to divide itself again, not between Allies and Axis, but between East and West. Yet, in the ruins of hospitals once built to treat enemies, a different kind of order was taking root. The story of American medical mercy had already crossed borders. Soviet officers, touring US-run POW facilities in occupied Germany, expressed a mixture of disbelief and disdain. To them, the idea of providing full medical care to the defeated Wehrmacht was bourgeois softness. But to the Americans, it was something else, a statement of principle. The US Army Medical Corps maintained that the Geneva Convention was not a political gesture, but a moral compass. If they broke it in victory, it would never be honored again in war. That idea began to resonate beyond the barracks and wards. American military academies introduced case studies from POW hospitals into ethics training. West Point cadets analyzed operations where medics had risked their lives to save German soldiers. The conclusion was always the same: moral strength sustains strategic strength. In post-war Germany, the former prisoners carried those lessons home. Many became part of the new Bundeswehr in the 1950s. Officers who had once been treated in American hospitals now teaching recruits about restraint, discipline, and international law. Others returned as civilians, writing about the strange humanity they had found in captivity. A 1952 German Red Cross bulletin quoted one such man: "They treated us as men first, prisoners second. That was when I understood what freedom meant." Meanwhile, the hospitals themselves evolved into symbols of a different kind of reconstruction. The same facilities that had once received wounded under fire were now repurposed for civilian use. The Ulm Field Hospital, once filled with German POWs, became a local infirmary for displaced families and orphans. American and German nurses worked side by side, often with the same surgical instruments that had been used during the war. This medical cooperation foreshadowed the humanitarian alliances of the Cold War, the Marshall Plan's public health programs, NATO's shared medical protocols, even the early seeds of Doctors Without Borders, which drew inspiration from the military ethic of impartial care. The battlefield had, paradoxically, taught modern medicine to treat the world without borders. Yet not all legacies were comfortable. Declassified War Department correspondence reveals that some officers questioned whether treating enemy soldiers too well might weaken deterrence. Others worried that compassion could be exploited, that future enemies might see American mercy as predictability, not principle. But those concerns faded with time. The historical record showed no evidence that humane treatment ever emboldened the enemy. In fact, it often did the opposite. During Korea and Vietnam, enemy combatants repeatedly cited W.Thu's American POW hospitals as proof that surrendering to US forces meant survival. Still, for the medics who had lived through the experience, moral satisfaction did not erase the nightmares. Captain Halperin, now a civilian surgeon in Chicago, occasionally lectured at veterans' hospitals. When asked how he had treated German prisoners without hatred, his answer was simple: because that was the only way to stay human. His words captured what many of his generation never said aloud: that mercy had not been given for the enemy's sake, but for their own. They had seen what happened when cruelty became a system, and they refused to carry that contagion forward. In Germany, former POW Karl Voss, the young SS soldier Halperin had saved, kept his promise. He studied medicine in Hamburg, later serving as a Red Cross doctor in post-war refugee camps. In 1962, his clinic received supplies from an American humanitarian agency. Among the crates was a surgical kit stamped US Army Medical Department. 1944, he reportedly smiled and said only, "It's come full circle." That circle of vengeance giving way to virtue, of enemies turned caretakers, remains one of World War II's quietest miracles. While the headlines remembered battles and generals, the true victory of conscience was fought not on the front lines, but beneath the soft glow of hospital lamps. In the end, history's harshest war did not only destroy, it also revealed how far a human being could go, not to kill, but to heal. War is often measured in territory, casualties, and monuments. But in the quiet, white-lit wards of 1945, it was measured differently, in heartbeat, breath, and the simple act of tending to a stranger. The story of American hospitals treating wounded German soldiers reminds us that even amid destruction, humanity can assert itself with precision, discipline, and courage. These moments, a nurse's gentle hand, a surgeon's unwavering focus, a medic choosing duty over vengeance, were not grand gestures of heroism. They were small, quiet decisions that accumulated into a moral landscape more enduring than any battlefield gain. Mercy became both an instrument of survival and a statement of principle, that war does not have to extinguish conscience. The men and women who carried out this work understood something timeless. Compassion, applied consistently and without expectation, strengthens civilization as much as any law, treaty, or military strategy. Their patience, once enemies, now survivors, carried that lesson home, shaping post-war Europe in subtle but profound ways. They became doctors, nurses, teachers, and witnesses to what restraint and humanity could achieve when fear and hatred threatened to dominate. Even decades later, historians and ethicists look back on these episodes not merely as acts of care, but as proof that moral courage can coexist with the machinery of war. The images linger: stretchers moving under lamplight, antiseptic-smelling tents in snowbound forests, a young German soldier staring in disbelief at the hands that saved him. In the end, the measure of this moment is not in medals or memorials. It is in the enduring truth that even in the darkest chapters of history, human beings can choose restraint over cruelty, skill over retribution, and mercy over hatred. And for those who lay wounded beneath flickering lamps, those choices became a lifeline, a reminder that even in war, some light refuses to be extinguished. The war would end. Cities would rise from rubble, but in the memory of the saved, and the hands that saved them, the quiet triumph of conscience would endure forever.